Hello people, and continuing on from the previous World War I series, we now move on to the sequel, everybody's favorite World War II. Hooray! So, here's a little bit of an introduction into the topic, and without further ado, let us begin. So, the Second World War was a truly global conflict with hugely destructive warfare in both Europe, the Pacific, as well as North Africa. You have the Western Front in Europe again, and another Eastern Front, the Russians against the Germans, and you've got the Pacific campaigns in which the US and the Commonwealth, especially the UK, had to fight back Japan as Japan kind of steamrolled into Asia in the early part of the during the 1930s, and thus triggering a chain reaction of military dominance in the East. And North Africa with the North African campaigns with the German panzer divisions and whatnot. So, yep, the infamous raising the flag on Iwo Jima by the US Marines and stuff. So, the first thing you have to consider is did the First World War make the Second World War inevitable? And as a student, you might want to consider these questions, such as this one and the last two questions at the bottom. But let's go back to here first. In a way, yes, because the carnage of the First World War that depleted the resources of Germany and the other countries did make the economic and social conditions for World War II. For example, creating a kind of a turmoil and social struggle, like people are poor and everything, and everybody's resenting at the government not doing much, and it created the situation, it created the breeding grounds for the Second World War. So, yes, you can argue that, yes, the First World War did make the Second World War inevitable, because without the carnage, diplomatic negotiations could have possibly had a high chance of preventing the Second World War from ever happening. But since there was a period of suffering that happened before, yes. And also, another key thing to remember is the Treaty of Versailles following the First World War. So you could think of the question as First World War, the period of the First World War, not just the war itself, because obviously without the Treaty of Versailles, it's a pretty high chance that Germany wouldn't do anything that drastic. So yeah, here's some Royal Irish Fusiliers or something. I think it's the Irish Fusiliers or something. Anyway, so moving on, the First World War and the subsequent peace settlements reshaped the map of Europe and created problems which destabilized international relations. Yes, the peace settlements, quote-unquote peace, a diktat, forced peace on Germany, they kind of rewrote the map of Europe, because the treaties forced the various central powers to forfeit the territory and resources gained, and just since they're the losing side, they have to pay reparations and lots of money. And because of the limitations imposed on them by the treaties, you have to get rid of lots of empire gains, resources, armies, and whatever. So in a process of punishing the central powers, you basically give resources to the victors, and given that the victors were already quite powerful, you're basically creating an unbalanced world situation, thus destabilizing international relations in favor of the dominating powers. Et voilà. So, among the more powerful European states, Germany and Italy were dissatisfied, obviously, because they too were hit hardest. Germany got the blame for what Austria-Hungary started, or what the July crisis started. So the War Guilt Clause, remember that? And along with Japan, because they became aggressors, because Germany did all that expansion into Europe, Czechoslovakia, whatever. Italy did Abyssinia, and Japan did infamously Manchuria. So unfortunately, the League of Nations was rubbish, and they also had the power to veto any decision placed upon them, because they were permanent council members, especially Italy and Japan. So the aggressors were not able to be put down, so it undermined international order, as we see here. Undermined international order. Anyway, the Soviet leadership was also angry at the Paris settlement and the creation of states such as Poland, now the former Russian territory. Again, because the USSR suffered quite a bit, especially. They kind of tanked so hard during both world wars. So the USSR was rustled, Jimmy's were rustled, so he had to turn inwards to domestic policy to kind of recover its economy, given that they just had a revolution. And Stalin kind of wanted security for collective security as the League of Nations established, but unfortunately, he also signed the Nazi-Soviet pact. He kind of changed direction, so that's a kind of a thing. And of all the great powers, Britain and France wanted to preserve the shaky peace. But of course, being roast beef and La France baguette, they couldn't agree on how to achieve this. So again, it is personal interest and national interest that still dominates over the so-called welfare of peace and preserving of peace in the entire world. So the thinking is still relatively not as postmodern as now. So yeah, it's pre-modern thinking. So everybody's still focused on personal gain instead of democracy and welfare as a whole. Because to be honest, it's still kind of democracy isn't such a thing when you have bloody empires around. Anyway, the U.S., a major player in determining the outcome of the First World War, because of the fresh American troops, as I've mentioned last time, shaping the subsequent peace treaties, retreated into isolationism. Wilson wanted the League of Nations, but then Congress said no, US will not be involved in any other world conflicts, so they just went into isolation. This is a bad move, and key being that the major power with the major military and the best economy in the world is not backing an international so-called peace organization, you're going to have problems. So of course, problems left unresolved by the 1919-20 peace treaties or created by them kind of rustled the jimmies. So you've got the Ruhr crises, but Germany kind of tanked, the economy tanked and they couldn't pay anymore, and the Corfu incident, and then the series of conflicts all over Europe in the early 1920s. So it's basically setting up the stage for the Second World War. Again, you can see both sides forming. As discussed before, the financial instability, aka also the Great Depression, was a legacy of the Great Depression that happened after the financial instability, especially in Germany, because of the war draining resources, kind of made, well, relations sour because you've become poor and everybody else gets to dominate you. So yeah, as I've said, the League of Nations happened, but the US was not in it. Look at this bridge here, the Keystone USA not being in the vital bridge that is the League of Nations bridge. So the US did a selfish, it's not selfish, it's understandable at the time, but the fact that they didn't commit themselves to what they planned up, this shows a bit of hypocrisy there. Anyway, next, Germany's relations with France and Britain were improved to an extent in the mid-1920s, and Germany became more stable. So they were admitted into the League, as seen here, admitted as a permanent member, but then they left afterwards, given Hitler's rise to power. And the last thing of the intro is that we have to consider Hitler. Germany became one of the most powerful military and industrial states in Europe, had somehow managed to be led by a dictator with a violent racial vision. So that means a guy, as an extremist with a powerful country in charge, you're gonna have lots of an extremist in charge of a very, very powerful country with very good engineering and technology. You're gonna have problems. So consider these two questions. Was Hitler a master planner or an opportunist? Was Hitler's foreign policy unique, or was it a continuation of earlier German governments? For the first question, you could argue that he was a master planner because he was a master planner in terms of getting his country back up to scratch. I mean, in 6 years, from 1933 to 1939, he managed to get the country rearmed, get millions of troops back, improve the economy because you give lots of national projects to work on, and basically send everyone into the army. He was a master planner in preparing his country for war, and an opportunist given his gambles to take over, such as annexation of Austria, advancing into the Rhineland, etc., etc. He knew when to strike, and he knew when to strike in order to kind of pass his actions off as a so-called quote-unquote German need, or just an quote-unquote accident, or quote-unquote a kind of just a run-of-the-mill thing. You could argue that, so I would advise you to consider this more. And secondly, the foreign policy unique or continuation of earlier German governments. You could say that his foreign policy was unique to the extent that it included those very violent racial visions, such as the persecution of the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, etc., and the fact that Germany was superior to everyone. But you could argued that it was a continuation of earlier German governments in the realms and to the extent of, like, for example, Lebensraum, a Greater German Reich. It's basically empire building under a different name. Anyway, so this is a short and brief intro into World War II. It sets the scene. It's not exactly talking about it, obviously, given that it's an introduction. But yeah, just consider these questions, well, not these questions, but just consider this setting of the stage for the Second World War. And next time we'll be diving into the meat of the Second World War. So thanks for listening. Comment, rate, and subscribe. And I hope you've enjoyed this. And stay tuned for more. So bye bye.